Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor. Well, as promised before the break, here is a discussion from various international geopolitical experts on the RT show titled CrossTalk. It's hosted by Peter Lavelle. The discussion centers on the April 9th discussion on the topic, What Does the West Lose by Alienating Russia? Listen carefully for some ideas, most of which you won't hear in the Western mainstream media.
Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Pivoting Russia, the Western-engineered crisis in Ukraine has put Russia and the West on a collision course. The drumbeat for greater sanctions against Moscow continues, but Russia has options. It could seek intensified relations with the East. How will this change the geopolitical order? To CrossTalk Pivoting Russia, I'm joined by my guest, Amitav Acharya in Washington. He is a professor of international relations at the American University, as well as author of the new book, The End of the American World Order. In London, we have Enze Han. He is a lecturer on international security of East Asia at the University of London. And in Moscow, we cross to Alexander Mercouris. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Alexander, if I can go to you first here in Moscow. Tell us how we got here, because at the beginning of this century, Vladimir Putin just became president in 2000. He reached out to the West. He reached out to the West on many different levels: economic, security, financial, the works.
Indeed.
How did we get to this point now?
What you say is absolutely right. If you look at Putin, when he first became president, he was undoubtedly someone who wanted, more than anything else, good relations with the West, and indeed wanted to integrate Russia with the West. At the time of the 2001 terrorist attacks, he went out of his way to help the US. Where it went wrong is that the US demanded from him and from the Russians, we shouldn't always talk about Mr. Putin here, from the Russians, and gave back very little. If we go back to 2001, for example, they gave an undertaking that they would not establish military bases in Central Asia beyond the conflict in Afghanistan, and then almost immediately that's exactly what they did. And by 2007, Mr. Putin was making speeches in Munich, very moderately and in a very restrained way, complaining about how NATO had been expanded eastwards and how pledges that had been made to Russia in the 1980s had not been kept. And now we've had more situations since. We had the 2008 war with Georgia, where the West took the Georgian side, and now, of course, we've had the Ukraine.
Okay. Amitav, in Washington, Russia may pivot to Asia. What does that mean to you?
Well, the American pivot to Asia is basically a way to pay more attention, more strategic attention, and deploy more military resources to Asia as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan winds down, and the United States is increasingly concerned about the rise of China. So pivoting was a way, is a policy to redeploy some of those forces from the Middle East and Europe to Asia. But in military terms, it doesn't really it doesn't mean much. But I think as a political statement, as a shift in U.S. policy, it does.
Okay, and say in London, I mean, everybody seems to be pivoting to Asia right now. The United States, we have Russia now wanting to turn there. What does that mean? I mean, it's going to be a crowded neighborhood, huh?
Right. Well, I mean, what it really means, I think, at this point, probably some rethinking in Washington in terms of whether there should be some balance between the Pacific and the Atlantic theater. And I think at this point, probably people are already thinking that probably some kind of diversion of attention of China will be shifted back to Europe and Russia.
Okay, Alexander, it's really quite interesting because the Obama administration has been talking about this pivot, and then you have all these voices in Europe saying the Americans should stay and actually beef up their presence there instead of withdrawing. It's an interesting, example where maybe it's the tail wagging the dog.
Well, it's also an indication of how badly, in many ways, the United States has handled its relations, because it's got very bad relations at the moment with Russia, and its relations with China are under strain. We heard before the previous guests talking about how the United States is concerned about the rise of China, and there was the pivot to the east by the United States in order to counter that. And now, at the same time as that's happening, and we've had all sorts of issues with China over disputed islands, over all kinds of other things, we have the United States also now having to focus on Europe too. So, where it could have been friends with both countries, and we spoke about how Russia at the beginning of this century wanted to be a friend of the United States has now got itself into a situation where it's got bad relations with both countries, and both countries seem to be deepening their relations with each other in response to the pressure they feel from the United States. And that is a pivotal change.
Let me just add something to what I said, and also in response to what we just heard. First of all, the pivot policy was done well before the Ukraine crisis.
Agreed.
And the United States has been concerned about China right from the late 1990s or early 2000s. And pivoting is also not just a military strategy. It has economic and diplomatic components. What is new, though, with the crisis in Ukraine, with the revitalization of NATO, the United States now have to decide whether it can afford to pivot as much as it had thought it could, because now NATO will demand more strategic attention and resources. So I think this creates a strategic dilemma for the U.S., and there's no easy way out. But let me add one quick point. Even the relations between the U.S. and China are not as good as they could be. They're not as bad as current relations between the U.S. and Russia. And the U.S. Defense Secretary is just visited or visiting Beijing. And also the majority of countries in Asia do want the United States to be around in the region. So I think there's a big difference between U.S. relations with China and U.S. relations with Russia for the time being.
And say, in London, how do you think the Chinese will look at Russia intensifying its relationship with the East, turning to the East away from the West?
Well, I mean, as said earlier, I mean, there's some thinking in the U.S. basically during the Bush Jr.'s administration at the beginning, they were thinking basically try to focus on China and East Asia. However, 9/11 happened, and basically, near Sharma, for example, in Chicago, would argue that U.S. wasted 10 years of strategic attention on the Middle East rather than focusing on China. So what it means now is basically that when Russia is trying to in some ways reassert its influence in its previous influence in the post-Soviet republics. And from China's point of view, it actually is a good opportunity. Some of the tensions, not only in terms of administration's strategic and economic attention, but also domestically within the U.S. public's interest in terms of how much the image of China, and now as the enemy, for example, probably would be some kind of diversion to Russia. And that would be some kind of street bonus for China at this point.
Alexander, one of the interesting things, probably the only good thing Boris Yeltsin did as president, is that he strengthened relations with China. And we look at the Central Asia, where China and Russia have mutual concerns, and they work together, they cooperate. This is a plus for both countries.
It is indeed. And I think it's important, though, to say relations between Russia and China have been good for many years, since the 1990s. There have been problems. I mean, there were problems about Chinese copying or allegedly copying Russian weapons and things of that kind. But they've been good. What we are starting to see, though, is, from the Russian point of view, a feeling that they want to go beyond what are merely good relations towards building a strategic relationship. And I think the Chinese, to some extent, in fact to a great extent, probably want the same thing, because each country has a lot to offer the other. We've seen, for example, how the events in the Ukraine have actually benefited China in its relations with the United States. So each country can support the other, can help to take the pressure off the other, and has a lot to offer economically the other. And I think this is a major shift from merely good relations to an actual strategic relationship.
Amitav, in Washington, a major shift, a paradigm shift. Is it a big deal? Is this a big deal, what's going on right now?
Yeah, if I can just start by commenting on what the previous speaker said, Alexander, I think, said. I think it's very important to bear in mind that I agree that Russia and China have much common ground, and the crisis I think the U.S. relations with each of these two countries could move them together. But I really am skeptical that that will develop into like an alliance, the strategic alliance, like in the 1950s, the China-Soviet alliance, for example. But the Chinese now become a global player, and they have a lot of common interest also with the United States. And the other thing is the Chinese are also very careful about, while they may have sympathy, they understand the reasons why Russia went to Crimea, for example, but the annexation of Crimea doesn't go down very well with a lot of the Asian countries, including some sections in China. So one has to be very careful how this Russia-China relations might proceed. I think a partnership, yes, a strategic partnership, but some kind of an alliance. You know, China has a policy of not having military alliances or strategic alliances in the conventional sense with any country. And it will require a big change of policy on the part of China to change that.
Can I just say...
Go ahead, Alexander, jump in. Go ahead. Go ahead, jump in.
I was very careful not to use the word alliance because I don't think there's any possibility of an actual military alliance such as the one that existed between Russia and China in the 1950s. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a strategic relationship. In terms of diplomatic activity, that to a great extent has been happening for a long time now. Now we're going to see a deepening of other ties, of economic ties, of military ties. No other country that I know of, for example, sells military equipment to China. Apart from Russia. Russia is now going to start upgrading, apparently, the military supplies it is going to send to China. There's talk about sending sophisticated surface-to-air missiles there. There will probably be a major gas agreement soon.
Alexander, let me jump in here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the geopolitical order. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing pivoting Russia and the geopolitical order. Enze, I'd like to go back to you in London. We've heard a lot over the last 10 years about a multipolar world. Are we getting closer and closer to that now with this breach that we see with the United States and Russia and Europe and Russia?
Yeah, I think that's basically, to me, that's a trend of international order in the sense that previous decades also have been quite much the supremacy of the U.S. in terms of its way of dealing with international affairs around the world. And so probably this time seems like, you know, with the rise of China, with the rise of Russia, and also in terms, for example, this time, when you look at the General Assembly voting, all the BRIC countries actually abstained from the vote, right? So that is not just China, but also India, as well Brazil, and which means that many of the developing countries now actually do not really necessarily see things together in the same way as the U.S. see it. So perhaps there is not necessarily, I'm not saying that is going to be sort of more direct confrontation, but definitely the supremacy and the hegemony of the U.S. Will probably pretty much will be diminished in a great extent. I will say something about the Russia-China relations, though. And in recent years, people have talking about China's increasing presence in Central Asia. But difference, of course, with the U.S. approach towards NATO Western, encroachment, the Chinese presence in Central Asia was more conciliatory towards the Russian interest. Every time Chinese visitors to Central Asia would basically say specifically that the Russian dominance would be respected. And I think that's quite difference between the two sides. And also, I mean, I agree with the previous speakers in terms of I don't think there is going to be a clear alliance between China and Russia. However, there must be some kind of partnership necessarily or developing between two sides in terms of coordination, in terms of dealing with international issues around the world. And as well, in terms of and China's economic interests with Russia, different between China and the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. is that there are actually quite a lot of economic engagement between China and the U.S. So which means that perhaps the Russian side want to develop more economic partnership with the Chinese side, but I think that the dependence is more skewed towards the Chinese because China definitely needs Russian oil and gas, but I don't know how much other, for example, economic market capacity the Russians can offer for Chinese products. So in that case, that I think China still have to rely heavily on the Western market. So which means that the interest for China in meddling through this current relation between Russia and the West will be very tricky.
Okay, Amitav, in Washington, your book is...
If I can jump in on the...
Okay, I was going to promote your book, but go ahead. All right, give me the title of your book and then go ahead.
The book is this, and I was going to talk directly about the book. I think the idea of returning to multipolarity is something that I don't believe in. I mean, what is true that the unipolar moment is ending or it's over, but what comes in its place is not multipolarity, but what I call multiplex. It's a world of several powers, but who are woven into a very complex relationship. So multipolarity with complexity. And the complexity would be economic links and even political, diplomatic links. This is not the Cold War. This is not the Europe of the 19th century or early 20th century. There is far too much economic interdependence, far too much interactions in a whole variety of fronts where our countries share a common interest. So I think the idea of a multiplex world with several great powers, no single hegemony by any power, but with waves of interdependence, both at the regional and the global level, is what likely. And I also argue that the United States is no longer going to dominate world order. Well, it's going to be an important player. But it has to walk through other actors, including regional institutions, allies, and the rest.
Okay, Alexander, I think it's really interesting. What does the West lose with this kind of breach it has with Russia? Some very harsh things are being said right now, and we both know the crisis in Ukraine is far from over. What does the West lose by alienating Russia?
Well, straight away, we have a situation of great tension. And there's considerable worry in Europe about severing an economic relationship with Russia. We just heard about economic interdependence, and that is a major concern. And if you look at the German business community, for example, they are not happy about the idea of sanctions against Russia at all, because it goes completely against their economic interests. However, beyond that, Russia is a major geopolitical player. It is a great power. It is located in the center of Eurasia. It has powerful military. It has enormous economic and natural resources. It cannot simply be ignored, and its weight matters. So antagonizing Russia, making in effect an enemy of Russia, is not a good situation. It's not a good play for the United States or for the Western powers. And again, I come back to what I said. We're not talking about an alliance between Russia and China, because neither side wants that for many good reasons. But a strategic partnership between China and Russia presents more problems to the Western powers. It limits further their freedom of action. We saw that back in the autumn over the Syrian crisis, where the Chinese and the Russians are working very actively together, and I am sure we will see it more and more as the international situation develops.
And say in London, if you were a policymaker sitting in Beijing right now, how would you observe the relationship or the ongoing crisis between the West and Russia? How would you explain it to your boss, for example?
Well, I mean, I think the Chinese definitely made, in some ways, very clear that position in itself. They try to respect try to maintain some kind of status quo of Ukraine situation. So on one hand, acknowledge that Russia has a specific interest in terms of doing what it did towards Crimea, but also in terms of not necessarily endorsing the unilateralism that Russia did in terms of militarily through a vote, but basic annexation of other country territory. But I think overall,
let's be clear here. I mean, we can't forget the issue of self-determination. The people of Crimea made that decision. If you agree with that decision or not, but that is a historical fact right now. No, I understand very clearly. Right. China is very, very concerned about separatism. I absolutely understand that. So go ahead and continue. Go ahead.
No, but I don't think that China is necessarily worried about separatism itself. And but at the end of the day, it's all about power itself, right? In terms of whether you're afraid of meddling by other countries. But I think what China necessarily do not want to come out openly is to challenge, for example, this particular norm about territorial change, right? And I think that's consistent from its previous position in international diplomacy throughout. So what I'm saying is that Beijing is actually sitting in a very good point of time in terms of the relation both with the West, but as well with Russia. In terms of Russia, I mean, Putin actually appreciated what China has done on the Crimea issue. So I think that in that case, on the one hand, I said early on that one of the speakers said the American is visiting China, etc. But I don't really see that it's going to be any better relation between the U.S. and China. There's always going to be suspicion and all kinds of confrontation between the two sides. Much of the conflicts, in some ways, are almost like apparent in terms of relation with Japan, with relation to South China Sea. So I actually don't see that there's going to be any close relation between U.S. and China in the future. So that means basically there are much more room for coordination between China and Russia. It doesn't really mean there can be formal alliance, but then some kind of coordination in terms of both at the United Nations, but also elsewhere, probably be the future pattern of relation between the two sides.
Amitav in Washington.
Can I say something here?
Go ahead, jump in. You always anticipate me. Go right ahead. Please do.
Sure. In relation to the question about the topic of the day, the Russian pivot to Asia. Now, there are a couple of very important challenges. One challenge is that if you do a pivot, you need the support of more than one country. It's not just going to be Russia, China, but also it has to be Russia and the other countries in the region. Now, that will have to include Japan, the ASEAN countries, where Russia is building good relations with so far. And that's really important. That will require Russia devoting a lot more resources, a lot more attention, including economic and strategic military resources to the region. And it's not very clear to me that Russia would or has the ability to do so. But the second thing is, and I want to be very clear on this, annexation of any kind is a very important issue. It's a very pivotal issue in international relations.
Now, I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. Okay, this is why we call it a crisis.
I understand what Alexander said, and I think Russia had provocations, and there was, and the West has a lot to lose by having bad relations to Russia. But the fact is that there has been annexation creates a lot of concern, not only in Asia, but around the world. Now, people are willing to give Russia some benefit of the doubt, but if this proceeds even further, and it leads to, a lot depends on how Russia behaves from now on.
Well, can I just make one very quick point? I mean, we heard one of the previous speakers talking about what a conciliatory policy China had towards Russia in Central Asia. Contrast that with the very aggressive policy the United States and its allies have followed in places like the Ukraine. And I think there is a very great deal of understanding around the world of the Russian position, not just a small amount of slack. We saw that at the General Assembly vote when almost half the countries in the world refused to support a resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, despite the importance most countries attach to the question of territorial integrity. So I think that's an important distinction to make.
Alexander, I'm sorry, my friend, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, London, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.